I'm the rivers educator. I'm the rivers educator for UW-Madison Division of Extension, and I'm joined by Katie Bradford. She's the program manager for our Water Action Volunteers program, and Paul Skowinski, who's the program manager for the Citizen Lake Monitoring Network. And we're joined here today for our Winter Water Talks program, which is just a fun way to be able to connect with you, our volunteers, during the season where we're not out sampling. So we don't want to lose touch with you guys over the winter, and we want to keep you engaged and doing fun things. And so that's why we're hosting our Winter Water Talks session here today. So this is our second one of the season here today, and we are joined by Jamie Knack. She is an extension associate of ours, and she specializes in wildlife outreach. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and pass it over to Jamie.
All right. Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to just switch over myself. So hopefully if I can just get a thumbs up that you're seeing a full view of my presentation.
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I was asked to talk about maybe a couple of animals that utilize Wisconsin's rivers, streams, and lakes. And I shared with Emily that, hey, we actually have 4 fur-bearer species that are closely associated with water. And I decided that we'd focus on those. So with that, let's see if this is going. And then Emily, did you still want me to just mention briefly a little bit about my extension programming?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so I tried to limit it to just one slide here. I'm an extension wildlife specialist. I'm in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology on the UW-Madison campus. And I have so I have statewide responsibilities, and I have a few programs that go across state lines, and also a national program that I'm involved with. My audience is very similar to Emily's and others in that I work with both youth and adult, work with the general public. I do have some programming that works specifically with private landowners on helping them to manage their properties for wildlife. And then I also do some professional development training or programming for natural resource professionals. And most of the work that I do involves either the ecology or the management or the conservation of wildlife resources. Could be anything from how do we attract wildlife to, okay, how do we deal with nuisance wildlife? And we'll talk a little bit about that today too. And then a couple areas that are kind of near and dear to me and that I've been working on most recently are engaging the next generation in the outdoors. So this connection to nature, a lot of this stems from A Last Child in the Woods, the book, and the fact that our children are not spending near as much time outdoors as we are. And there's some real side effects to that happening. And then also I've been working with Chris Tiles, who's also in the Division of Extension, on legacy planning with woodland owners. So how do we help them with their succession and estate planning to ensure that forested lands remain intact and in the family if that's what their goals are. So that's a little bit about the work that I've been doing of late. So moving on to today's topic, I thought and this isn't necessarily an outline in terms of the order that I'm going to go, but we're going to learn what a fur bearer is, which ones are the semi-aquatic, and then I'm going to mix in some information as we go through those 4 species, talking about their life history traits, their value. I really want to come across with what is the value of Wisconsin's fur bearers, and then why and how they're managed. So first of all, it's a riddle here for you, but all fur bearers are mammals, but not all mammals are fur bearers. So fur bearers do not include domestic animals. So cows, pigs, I've got 2 cats running around the house here today. Those are not considered fur bearers. They have fur and they're mammals, but they're not fur bearers. Fur bearers also don't include unusual mammals like bats or armadillos or marine mammals. And they don't include mammals if the fur is not used by humans. So mice, moles, porcupines. And fur bearers also don't include our big game mammals, even if their pelt is used. For instance, bear or deer, we use those pelts but we still don't call them fur bearers. We typically call them big game animals because they're primarily hunted for their meat. What is a fur bearer then? Usually they're classified as mammals that have been historically trapped for the value of their fur. And that value could be an economic value, but it also, that economic value is there because of the insulating properties that fur has, the commercial value of it, the fact that it provides warmth and durability, and not just the fur, but the leather. And so most mammals have 2 layers of fur. There's an under fur, and you can see it hopefully in the picture in the upper right-hand corner. As the guard hairs are pulled back, you see that softer down, looks more downy like. So under fur, it's the dense fur. It provides a soft undercoat of hair, and its role is to provide insulation and some water repellent qualities. And then we have the longer outer hairs that are usually glossy, and they grow through the under fur and protect it from matting and abrasion. And then just in general, we talked about fur bearers being an animal that historically was trapped or are trapped. What's important to know is trapping seasons generally coincide with when the fur primes. And that's when it's the thickest, the most luscious in the fur. And that's late fall and into the winter. And of course, from an animal standpoint, they're adding that fur to help survive the cold temperatures and so on. And the priming of fur typically is linked to the photoperiod. So the shortening of days is what triggers that production. So if we look at Wisconsin's fur bearer species, and this will vary a little bit state by state, but typically these are the species, the 20 species that we consider fur bearers in Wisconsin. And here they're categorized by their level of protection. So the first 15 species there, very common, they're abundant in the state. We generally manage them through a season date in terms of their harvest. I will say some of them can be trapped. Some of them can be trapped and hunted. It varies by the species. And a couple of these species like fisher and bobcat, they're regulated through a quota or a drawing for a very limited number of permits. And that's because their populations aren't abundant enough to have a bag limit per se. And I can go into that in more detail if that's questions you have later on. And then the other species listed are unprotected species, meaning that they could be harvested year round if you had a trapping or a hunting license. So they'd be very abundant. And then there's the category of protected, rare, or unknown. And those are species that maybe historically have been harvested, but are currently protected. They may be harvested in neighboring states. For example, both the American marten and the badger can be harvested in Minnesota and Michigan, but not in Wisconsin. And then what you don't see on this list are species like wolves or black bears. And while their fur may be used and has value, they're actually considered or classified as large carnivores. So if we go and look at these 4 semi-aquatic fur bearers, hopefully you recognize and have seen all of the 4 as you've done your volunteer work around Wisconsin's rivers and lakes. But these are our water associated fur bearers. So the beaver, starting from left to right, the beaver, the muskrat, the river otter, and the mink. And these are all species that are common and abundant in this. I'm going to just talk about each one of these species, and some of them have a little bit more management going on than others, and we'll dive into that a little bit too. So starting with the beaver, beaver is the largest rodent in North America. Occasionally they'll get to be 80 pounds in weight, but usually weigh about 45 to 60 pounds as adults. They're characterized by their flat tail, or widely recognized by that flat tail. And that tail has important adaptations for this beaver, both in water and on land. So on land, that tail can act as a prop as it's sitting or standing upright. It also serves as a counterbalance or for support when that beaver's walking on its hind legs, carrying building materials in its teeth and front legs. It can help support that beaver. And then in the water, the animal uses its flexible tail as a four-way rudder as it's swimming. And I don't know if you've ever come up to a lake or a pond where you've seen where there's beaver activity and you've had one slap its tail on the water. And that usually is a warning sign that the beaver will give to let all beavers in the area know that there's perhaps danger nearby. And it might also serve as a perhaps deterrent for predators. Additionally, the tail stores fat. And because it's nearly hairless, the tail also releases body heat. So it also helps beavers to regulate their body temperatures. Contrary to popular belief, though, the beaver doesn't use its tail to build dams or to pack that mud. That's not a use that we've been able to prove. So in addition, beavers have really large back feet. They've got 5 webbed toes, and their front feet are really tiny. They can help them to hold sticks or for gnawing and for helping to construct those dams. They also have those characteristic haired incisors, those large front yellowish stained incisors. And they have a transparent inner eyelid. So that eyelid is able to close when they're underwater to kind of protect them, but also allow them to see while they're underwater. And they also have very small eyes and ears. Ears and nostrils, and they're able to close those and shut those off as well when they're swimming. And another really cool adaptation that a beaver has is the split toenail. So on the hind foot, the second, if you're counting from the inner toes, starting at the body and working your way out, that second toe has a split nail. So there's a nail and then a horny growth between the nail and the toe itself. And that has a finely serrated upper edge that basically acts like a fine-tooth comb. And so the beaver can use that split toe to groom. And they groom for really 2 purposes. One, to remove dirt and debris, algae, burrs, parasites from their coat. And the other is to waterproof their coat. So the beaver can apply an oily substance from its anal glands to the outer layer of hair using with the help of its toes. And then also it has the beaver has castor glands, and these castor glands produce a very pungent thick liquid, and that's deposited as a scent marker, like from a territorial standpoint, that beavers will mark their territory to warn off other beavers in the area. So as far as their diet, they're eating twigs and the inner bark of aspen, poplars, alders, and they also eat aquatic plants like cattails or water lilies. In the fall, they'll cache these branches, they'll trim branches and bring them into the water and cache them below water near their lodge or their bank burrows so that they have access when the water freezes. They still have access to this underwater cache of branches. And beavers will also go ashore in the winter as long as they can still get through the ice right along the water's edge. Sometimes that remains open and they're able to access the land there. And I think when we think about beavers, we quickly think about beaver dams and beaver lodges or beaver houses. In addition, beavers are really a keystone species when we talk about wildlife. And by that, I mean they're habitat engineers, and they actually create wildlife. They'll remodel their environment to really suit their needs. So they'll dam up a small stream, which creates a backup of water, which creates a pond or a wetland. And then they'll build a lodge in that area. And then surrounding the pond, you'll find all sorts of canals and runways that they're using to transport building materials for the dam or food to those food caches that we talked about. So this is where beavers get into, this is where the controversy lies with beaver management, is that this activity, this habitat building, changing of the environment, has pros and cons. And we have both management that occurs on either side of that, and we have wildlife that benefits on either side of that. So the pros is that you create some wetland habitat that benefits other species like otter or mink or muskrats, certainly deer, especially waterfowl and water birds and grouse all benefit from that pond. And then the cons are sometimes these dams are blocking streams, especially high-class trout streams, that it can end up changing water temperatures. It can impede migration for these trout in terms of reproducing. And then also from a human standpoint, they can clog culverts and cause a lot of infrastructure damage to roads and railroad tracks and flood farm fields and things like that. And then getting back to their life strategies, beavers live in colonies. Colonies will typically include the adult pair, and they're monogamous and mate for life. The colony will also then include the offspring or the kits from that year and yearlings from the previous year. So a young kit will stay with that colony for 2 years before they venture out on their own. Beavers are typically breeding January through March. The kits are born April through May. Average size about 3 to 4 kits per litter. And then I'll just point out, I'm sure most of you are well aware that beavers were a major player in the fur trade and still are a valued fur bearer for their pelts and the economic role that they play. So they were part of the fur trade, which began in the 1600s in what is now Canada. And the fur trade continued for more than 250 years as Europeans traded with indigenous people for beaver pelts. And these pelts were used as currency among the fur traders. And that demand led to beaver being extirpated in the middle to the late 1800s. And extirpated is not the same as extinct. It means they were no longer in the area where they naturally occurred. So extirpated from the state, from that region, but not extinct. What drove this demand for the beaver pelts? I think most of you are well aware of the popular European fashion trend of felt hats. And those were beaver felt hats. And so that there was a huge demand in the European markets for beaver. And again, that's what put the value on it as a trade good with the Native Americans. And that's also where we get the term mad as a hatter. And so that expression is linked to the hat making industry because there's mercury involved in that process, and mercury poisoning is what drove people mad, and you got the term mad as a hatter. And so once beaver were among the most widely distributed mammals in North America, they then became eliminated from much of their range in the 1800s, both because of unregulated trapping and logging. And then eventually with the decline in the demand for beaver pelts and with proper management and protection, we also had a lot of translocation and reestablishment of beaver into their former range. They are now bouncing back. So in Wisconsin, our lowest levels were around the 1900s. We estimated about 500 beaver in the state. And through slow recovery in the mid 1900s, by 1980, beaver were again abundant in at least central and northern Wisconsin. And today it's important to recognize that the trapping that occurs now is regulated trapping, meaning there are laws and regulations just like there is for hunting or fishing. And those laws are enforced by conservation wardens or conservation officers. So we also have the Lacey Act, which took place in the 1900s. And that was an act that prohibited trafficking or taking illegally harvested wildlife, fish or plants across state borders. And that's effectively what led to the end of market hunting. So that occurred in 1900, and we were kind of in a rebuilding phase from then on. And today, the DNR, so the DNR is basically holds the public trust doctrine. So it's establishes a trustee relationship of government to hold and manage wildlife, fish, our waterways for the benefit of the resources and the public. And the DNR serves as the trustee in that relationship. And today, along with stakeholder input, the DNR manages the state beaver population. And so the hard challenge here is considering both the beneficial and the detrimental impacts that beaver can have on habitat and Wisconsin as a whole. They've decided to divide the state into 4 different management zones so that they can more specifically regionally manage those beaver populations. So this management plan was updated from the 1980 plan. So the current plan goes through 2025. And in zones A and B, which are the primary zones where we have beaver, the current goal in those zones is to maintain the level of beaver or to even slightly increase the beaver population in those zones. In C, so the southern part of Wisconsin, the goal is to maintain beavers at the current population level. And then in zone D, it's to either maintain or maybe even allow for a slight decrease in that population level. And so again, we're managing a lot of different views to stabilize and maintain both suitable habitat, beaver populations, but also to limit human beaver conflicts or allow for the opportunity to mitigate those conflicts as needed. So beaver management also includes a lot of surveying work, which everybody on this call is very in tune on doing. We continue to have a beaver task force made up of a number of stakeholders, also including Native American inputs as well. There's an annual beaver trapping questionnaire that licensed trappers complete, and that helps as an indice of trends in the beaver population, at least in terms of the harvesting. We also, Wildlife Services is the government organization agency that the DNR cost shares with to intensively remove beaver and beaver dams in specifically designated areas or for reasons. So whether it's to protect high quality trout streams, critical wild rice resources, or infrastructure, Wildlife Services is contracted to help in those specific situations to reduce or remove beaver populations or dams. And then we also have an annual Wisconsin Furbearers report, which includes a number of furbearers that again allows us to look at indices in terms of the number of people trapping, the number of furs being purchased, and just to look at trends in the beaver population. And so currently, I was just looking, so the most recent data we have in terms of population analysis was from a helicopter survey in 2014. That's a survey that the state was doing every 3 years, but it's just getting to be so costly with the helicopter that they've suspended that survey, and they're looking at some other survey and research strategies in lieu of that. So that was surveying in zones A and B. And in each of those, they had approximately 5,000 beaver colonies in each of those zones. So 10,000 colonies, and then you have to extrapolate that depending on what their average beaver per colony is. So right now, I think the most recent data I've seen has been approximately 93,000 beavers statewide. And if we look back the last couple of years for harvest records, about 17,000 to 20,000, depending on the year, in terms of how many beavers are harvested, and that would be statewide. And then I just want to show a couple of the challenges that can be there. Again, the photo in the upper left-hand corner is a beaver dam. When you think about the benefits to wildlife and the waterfall, you think about, like, if I was going to put a trail camera out somewhere to just see wildlife, I'd put it right on that beaver dam. It's amazing how many wildlife species will cross that dam or utilize that dam for either hunting, just moving across the landscape and so on. But depending on where this is and whose property is on the backside that's getting flooded, that may or may not be something the landowner's willing to tolerate. And you can see they're starting to take down that tree in the upper, or on the left side of that upper left-handed picture. So are you willing to tolerate that, or does that pose a problem for you? And then certainly in the upper right-hand corner, we've got a beaver who's packed this culvert with sticks and essentially blocked it, likely causing flooding on the other side. May not be something we can tolerate. So these are some of the problems that are there. There are a number of solutions to help mitigate this damage, whether you're working on public land or on your own private land. So we've had a number of cases, even in Madison, where I am, where parks are wrapping trees with mesh hardware cloth to make sure beavers aren't gonna take these mature trees out of the parks. And so that's one strategy especially on private land. There's also a well-studied technique called using a Clemson beaver pond leveler. It's basically a flow-through device that runs a pipe through the beaver dam and makes it hard for the beavers to figure out where that flow is coming from. And, they don't necessarily sense the water movement, and they're not able to back up the dam. So instead of repeatedly removing a dam, you develop a device that goes through the dam and allows for that water flow. And then it could be just using a box type barrier on the right-hand side to protect those culverts from material being able to, again, build up around them and block those culverts. So there is a lot of research in terms of what can be done to mitigate some of those issues. And I don't expect you to read this. I just wanted to share that on the Department of Natural Resources website, if you typed in beaver management or nuisance, you would get to some fact sheets on the laws and regulations in terms of what you can and can't do. So from a recreational trapping standpoint, we can't shoot beaver. There's not a hunting license to shoot beaver. You can trap them with a license. But on a private property, a private landowner has additional provisions to be able to deal with that nuisance. And in that case, a private landowner is allowed to shoot beaver to control those activities when they're causing the nuisance. But I just point this to you as you're working on your volunteer surveys and so on. You may come across people asking you these questions about beaver management and things like that. So you can point them to the DNR's website and some of these regulations. In addition, there's a really nice fact sheet publication on beaver control guidelines. And again, just kind of a quick fact sheets on how to mitigate some of those issues. I'm going to move on to muskrat, and the other species I'm going to cover here won't take as much as the beaver did. I wanted to start with that one. So muskrat, they're about half the size of a beaver. And the big difference here is in that tail. So they have a pretty much hairless tail, but it's rat-like. It's flat and skinny. They also have those incisors. They're also a rodent. And their name comes from a musky odor that the small mammal gives off. They're also mostly nocturnal, so active at night, and stay pretty close to their lodges or their bank burrows. Let's see. They're also excellent swimmers. They use their tail like a rudder. They have specially adapted eyes and nose and a very unique respiratory system. They can actually stay underwater for up to 15 minutes to escape predators. And their most common predators are the mink, foxes, or at night, great horned owls, and in the daytime, hawks as well. You can keep your eyes out either in the winter or in the summer after a fresh rain and you've got a muddy shoreline. Their tracks will have a tail drag. So you see their foot marks, their placement, but you'll also see that tail dragging in the mud behind them. As far as diet, they eat mostly plants that grow along the water's edge, cattails, bulrushes, reeds, and actually if there's too many muskrat in a given pond or in an area, they can actually eat themselves out. So they'll eat up all of the food resources they have and then need to go and disperse to find new areas. But they'll also eat other material like clams or crayfish, frogs, even dead animals if they come across them. And if they're near farmland, they can be an issue in that they'll eat corn or some of their crop. And they'll also eat aquatic plants if other crops are not available. And they'll build these food beds or feed beds, like in the lower right-hand corner. So that's a raccoon. A muskrat that's kind of gathered up food and will sit there and eat it on these rafts or in a little, in this case, on a log that it's able to pile up some vegetation and eat it. I'm sure you've seen this in the winter where you see a frozen pond or lake with a number of huts or lodges or houses. And this is essentially where these muskrats are spending the time during the day. They'll build these plant mounds of plant material that's deep enough that at the bottom it's not freezing. And they'll essentially have a room with several muskrats in it. Their body heat will actually keep a plunge hole open or an underwater entrance for them to come into that and get above the ground level, the frozen lake, and live and sleep and eat from there. And as is the case with most rodents, muskrats will have fairly large litters. They usually mate in the spring, like in March or in April. And after mating in about 30 days, they'll have 4 to 8 young that are born blind and hairless in that burrow or the lodge. And then they'll have even 2 to 4 litters per year, which is really a strategy for a lot of prey species. Muskrat aren't much of a predator, but they're a prey for a lot of wildlife. And they'll have multiple litters a year. In terms of management, muskrats are managed or harvested during a regulated season in the winter. And again, you have to have a trapping license. And they're pretty hard to over harvest. And the reason that is they breed prolifically at a relatively young age, multiple large litters, and typically they'll experience a 70 to 90% turnover rate. So whether they're harvested or not, their population will have a lot of mortality. And thus there's really no bag limit on muskrats. And there's more muskrats harvested annually than any other furbearer in the state. Again, this kind of makes sense with them being kind of lower on the food chain. So in the most recent years, the last 4 or 5 years, the harvest for muskrats is anywhere from 100 to 200,000. Pretty variable, and that can play in, that can be a result of depending on what fur prices are as well. And then I'd also add that, muskrats have a huge ecological value to them as well by eating cattails and other wetland vegetation that can clog our waterways or become overabundant. And also these lodges, they are really common nest sites for species like Canada geese. You often see the first Canada goose nest in the spring is on top of a muskrat house in the middle of a frozen lake or pond. But they do cause problems as well. They can burrow into stream banks or ditches or shorelines. They can get onto shoreline properties and enter yards and get into gardens and eat vegetation there as well. And so as a result, there's a number of different strategies used to manage these nuisance muskrats as well. And again, fact sheets on the Department of Natural Resources website. If you have a berm in town or a retention pond, those are all like really great places where muskrats want to burrow into the side of that bank. So things you can do or strategies is to erect fencing around gardens. You can lay mesh fencing flat along the shoreline to deter burrowing activity, or just making sure you have a more gradual gradient. They really need a steep slope to burrow into. So if you can extend that gradient of the shoreline, that will make it less likely of a place for them to want to burrow. And you can also add riprap around the areas that they're coming up. So using stones 3 feet below the water, but also a foot onto the shore in specific areas can help keep muskrats out of that area. All right, I'm going to move on to mink. So mink are a member of the weasel family. They're a mustelid, and they have sleek, thick chocolate brown fur. And mink are going to have a white chin or throat or a white patch on their chest or on their belly, but somewhere on their underside, they're going to have some blotch of white fur. Their ears are really small since they don't stick out much from their head. They have these small beady eyes, and they too have these partially webbed toes on each foot that helps them get around in the water. I never realized that mink could swim until I saw it happen. I was at the Memorial Union in Madison. It's got a riprap shoreline that mink love to forage in. And I happened to see a mink and had gotten closer to it. And it dove into the water, out of sight, underwater, and came back with a sunfish in its mouth and perched on the side of this riprap and continued to eat this sunfish right in front of me. So really good swimmers, really voracious predators. Again, they're distributed throughout the state. And if you happen to see them, they can snarl or hiss if they're scared. They also have scent. Again, being a mustelid, they leave scent that is similar to a skunk, but not nearly as strong. And they'll mark territory as well. They also exhibit sexual dimorphism, which means that the males will always be larger than the females, almost half the size larger. And they're really opportunistic feeders, so they'll feed on whatever is most abundant or that they come across. But one of their top prey items is actually the fur bearer we just finished talking about, the muskrat. In addition, fish, frogs, snakes, birds, other rodents, anything they can get close to, they'll try to bite the back of the skull to kill that animal. In turn, mink are prey for animals like foxes or bobcats or great horned owls. For reproduction, it's kind of interesting. I'll grab the next animal in this as well. So the river otter, both of these mustelids have delayed implementation of the embryo. So they'll mate in the spring, but that embryo won't implant till months later. And then the gestation, like for a river otter, is about 2 months after that embryo implants. And in the case of these mink, they'll have a litter of 3 to 6 kits that are born in the spring in a den. They're again born hairless at birth, but quickly grow hair, eventually open their eyes. And in about 5 to 6 weeks, they're weaned, but stay close to mom up until the fall when they disperse. And mink are found throughout the state again. They're managed in zones similar to how we talked about the beaver management and how that's done. And looking at the fur harvest, they're not one of our prime at the top 3, species that are trapped or targeted for their fur. But I would say their annual population their annual harvest is around 4,000 to 6,000 animals. Then we'll get into the river otter. And the river otter is our largest member of the weasel family. Sleek, dark, brown critter. They look like they look similar in shape to other mustelids, weasel-like, but they are 3 to 4 feet long, and that includes about a 12 to an 18-inch tail. They're distributed across the state, but they're mostly in the northern half of Wisconsin, much less common in the southwestern and central 2/3 of the state. Again, they can be found in any of the waters we've been talking about: streams, rivers, marshes, lakes, ponds. Excellent swimmers. They again can stay underwater for up to 4 minutes, and they can dive to depths up to 40 feet. When I think about the river otter, I always think of them as like one of the most playful wildlife species I can think of. They always seem to be having fun. They like to wrestle and chase each other. They do play capture with their live prey, just like a cat does with a mouse. And in winter, you'll find these otters traveling overland by bounding 3 to 4 times, pushing with their hind feet, and then sliding a good 5 to 15 feet in the snow. So we call those tracks otter slides. And if you think about how otters are built, they're built really streamlined and fantastic swimmers in the water, but they're not really built for running across the land. And so they often will navigate on frozen lakes or with snow cover and use this mode of transportation where They're bounding and then they slide to be more efficient. And they have a territory of about 3 square miles, so a larger home range or territory than the other species we've been talking about. Let's see what else we're gonna say. They also use latrine sites. So this upper left-hand picture is an otter defecating or marking its territory. And they'll do that quite often, again, to mark that territory so other otters are aware. And you can even see there's like a slide going into the river right there. So that's a really common access point for these otters. As far as their diet, aquatic animals like suckers and minnows, sunfish, bass. They'll also eat crayfish, frogs, if they come across birds or nests of birds, that as well. Their reproduction, I mentioned this, their breeding season is typically late spring or winter, but they'll actually carry that embryo for 9 to 11 months before it actually implants. And then their actual gestation is about 60 days. Birth is typically in March or April, usually an average of 2 to 3 pups. And then that they stay with the adult again for a fair amount of time, 6 months to a year, and they reach their sexual maturity at 2 to 3 years old. So in Wisconsin, otters are one of the most intensively managed fur bearers, and it's because they have smaller populations than beaver and muskrat that I talked about earlier. And so we collect a lot of information in terms of otters that are harvested. So right now, if you purchased a trapping license, you would have tags, like if you were a deer hunter, you would have tags for 2 otter, and they could be used in either of the zones in the state, north or south. But once you harvest an otter, it has to be registered within, you have a day to register it essentially. Once you register that otter, you'll actually get mailed a CITES tag. And CITES, if you're not familiar, is the acronym for the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. And the reason this animal has to be tagged is because it's a look-alike species. It looks like it looks like our the sea otters. And so sea otters are heavily protected, and it needs to be tagged so that it's recognized as a legally harvested animal. So when you register it, you get mailed this CITES tag, which is the proof that it was a legal harvest. The state also collects age data. They collect a canine tooth every 3 years, and they can cross-section that canine tooth and count the cementum annuli, just like you would count the rings on a tree to determine how old it is. All that data goes into a model to look at our age structure of otter. And again, using that along with how many otter are harvested, we can keep tabs on this otter population and whether we need to increase the number of tags, decrease the number of tags, and so on. And same thing, there's also surveys that are done by the biologists at stream intersections, at bridges, bridge and stream intersection, to look at occupancy rates of otters throughout the zones. And then again, that can be an indice from year to year to look at what the trend of the population might be. And I just wanted to share this too, but if anybody's interested, again, on the DNR's website, if you just typed in wildlife reports, you can look at historic data on animals that have been trapped and harvested, Furbearer reports, all these surveys that we talked about, the helicopter surveys. You can dive into that data, and not just for furbearers, but for other wildlife species. And there's a survey that the state does, they produce an annual report on it, and you can take a look at that data. And I just have 3 slides left. I just wanted to kind of bring this into some sort of a conclusion here, but I'd argue that furbearers are an extremely interesting, cool suite of species. Again, 20 in the state. They play a really valuable role in ecosystems, whether they're predators, prey, or maybe both, whether they're a habitat engineer like the beaver. Valuable to humans. Some furbearers are actually consumed. So raccoon would be an example. Beaver, muskrat are all species that can be eaten and are, and whether that's human or it could be supplemented for a raw food diet for dogs and pets. In addition, their pelts, their skulls are used for educational purposes. Some of the glands that they have are utilized as well, either for using for trapping, but also can be used in the perfume industry. So skunk essence can be harvested and used as a base for perfumes, why perfumes linger as long as they do. They also have a non-consumptive value, just simply the fact that they're there, the aesthetic value that they provide to the public that might be hiking or photographing in the area, or private landowners that enjoy seeing wildlife around them. Economic, there's definitely a market there for their fur. That's usually or mainly a market that thrives in Russia and China. A long traditional use, again, the fur for its beauty, its durability, the insulative properties, the natural qualities that fur provides. And intrinsic value, just, having them on the landscape, that directly or indirectly benefits humans as well. And then in terms of fur bearer management, so why do we even need to get involved and manage these species? Why don't we just let them be? But there are species that can cause problems for humans. We've talked about a few of those, but overpopulation can actually hurt the species themselves too. And this has been a pretty big year for mange and red fox, at least in the Madison area. But there's other disease and negative impacts that wildlife species can have on each other. So even species restoration, as we try to restore piping plover or sea turtles in parts of North America, some predator management, which is often fur bearer management, helps for us to be able to restore those populations as well. So in some cases, fur bearer management does become necessary, either because of the habitat, because the species is too overabundant, or there's not enough and we're trying to restore those populations. And then lastly, if anybody is interested in attracting fur bearers, some things that you can do to do that, these four need permanent water. They rely on undeveloped shores, abundant food supply, which often means protecting your water quality, limiting the use of pesticides, either creating or maintaining riparian and wetland buffers. Again, that's really helping with insects, which supply food for frogs and amphibians and fish that a lot of these fur bearers are consuming. Creating brush piles or structure that can be used as denning sites. Retaining snags, so those are your standing dead trees or the fallen logs. Again, could be a den site for some fur bearers, but also it's shelter for prey that they may be consuming. And oftentimes having dead wood protruding into lakes and rivers, again, creates structure for that prey to hide and for the fur bearers to forage. And with that, I will entertain any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was an excellent presentation. I loved in the beginning the history of the mad as a hatter phrase. That was pretty interesting with the beavers. We do have a couple questions in the chat here. The first one is actually something I was wondering myself. Is there an easy way to tell a beaver lodge from a muskrat lodge, maybe location on the water or size?
Yeah, size for sure. Beaver lodges are much, much bigger. A muskrat lodge, I would say like 3 foot by 3 foot, is about as big as you're going to get. Beaver lodges are much larger, but if you want to be sure, go scour the area and look for sign. So you'll see that tail drag I talked about with the muskrat. It's gonna, it says skinny rat-like tail. A beaver, if it is dragging its tail, is going to be much wider, 3 to 4 inches wide. And just in general, other sign that you're going to come across will help you be certain of what that is. And keep in mind that muskrats, if they eat themselves out of an area, those could be abandoned lodges too that you're seeing. So they might not be active anymore if the muskrats have left that area. But size is usually the biggest determination.
Great. And just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. We'll read them as we have time here. Our next question is, what is the minimum depth of water required for muskrats? And do they readily disperse to new habitats like newly excavated wetland scrape?
Yeah, for sure. And so they do need to be in areas that aren't going to freeze out. So that's a really good question, and it depends on where you're located in the state, in terms of how deep how thick that ice is getting, and if you still have water underneath. But yeah, they do need to have access to running, open water underneath that lodge. So that'll vary a little bit. Have you ever heard the term runner rats? So in the spring, it's like when you are recording spring phenology, the first robin that you see, the first bluebird, a lot of us wildlife, we're recording the first runner rat we see. And what those are muskrats that are dispersing. They're getting kicked out now and left to go and find new habitat for themselves. And so on the beltline around Madison, or, out in the country, you'll come across a road-killed muskrat. And so those are muskrats that are looking for new territory, whether they've eaten themselves out or there's enough of a population that they need to seek new territory. And so certainly a wetland scrape would be something they would be, see as good habitat.
Great. Our next question is, how does delayed implementation of embryos help the species?
That's a really good question. And I think what it does is it allows them, I believe the strategy has to do with food availability. So they can breed in the spring or late winter, but make it through the time when there maybe isn't as much food. And then the last 2 months of that, when the embryo actually implants and they're going into that 60 days of gestation, the food availability is better. So if they're in better body condition, they would continue to proceed in that gestation. If they weren't in good body condition, they would likely abort that embryo. I would want to confirm that, but that's my thought process. Is it's a life strategy in terms of when food is available and you're in the proper body condition.
Okay, where do otters live in the winter?
So otters are going to be, they'll certainly spend time below ground, but they also will have like bank dens where they're denning up, or just any kind of cover along the shoreline that they can get under.
Are there maps on the DNR website that show locations of furbearers on public lands?
So I don't know if there's any, I'm thinking citizen science type, where iNaturalist, where you could plot observations. I'm pretty sure the state doesn't have something like that for exact, where beaver colonies are located. And the reason would be, we wouldn't want that information out there for people who are trapping, right? They'd be able to target those areas, and we don't want it to be that way. So I'm trying to think. The only thing I could think of is if people are reporting sightings on a site like iNaturalist for beaver lodges, but otherwise just stopping in at different nature centers and so on, they might have good tips on where there might be a local activity for river otters and so on, if your goal is to try to get a picture of them or to see them.
Okay. The next question I had emailed to me, this person lives on a lake and they're wondering, we have otter, but there are some complaints that the larger panfish population has decreased. So maybe first of all, can you speak to otter's effect on panfish populations, if there is one? And this gal is saying many residents do not want the otter trapped, and what might some options be?
Yeah, so that's a tough one. I would just say that there are issues. Otters can be a nuisance, and where I see it or I'm aware of it is like farm ponds. So let's say you have private property, you stock a pond and the otters find it and get in there and eat all the fish, right? That's the same thing that could happen with the great blue heron and other species too with these fish ponds. I would be tempted to reach out to the fisheries biologist that covers that lake and get their take on it, because there's a lot of things that can affect a sunfish population in a lake, not just otters. So if everything's healthy and in balance, otter are certainly going to take some of those prey, but not to the point where they're going to, cause an impact on that. If there's enough structure for those sunfish, if there's enough base, habitat, predation is kind of part of the system. It's meant to, it happens, and quality habitat can mitigate that predation loss. So I just reach out to the fisheries biologists because I think they'd have more scientific information to be able to dispute or concur with that observation.
That's great advice. We had another question in the chat about otters affecting fish populations, but I think you just really nailed your answer right there.
Very, it's a local situation. You really got to I need to know more about the local area.
Sure, yeah. So that wraps up the questions that were in the chat. We also had one, just so everyone knows, asking about recordings for this video, and we did start recording right at the beginning of the presentation, and we will be sending out a link to that recording as soon as we can get it uploaded to everyone that signed up for the talk. And so with that, I just want to take another opportunity to thank Jamie. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I really enjoyed your presentation, and hopefully we can have you back in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks again for the invite.
All right, thank you, and thanks everyone.